Sunday night, March 11th, 1888. New York sleeps under a mild sky. Thermometers read nearly 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It's raining. No one notices what is forming out over the Atlantic. No one notices that a few hundred miles off the coast, two air masses are about to collide like two trains running straight at each other. A mass of polar air is dropping down from Canada. A mass of warm air is rising up from the Gulf of Mexico. They meet exactly over the eastern seaboard of the United States. And then something rare happens. The low-pressure system doesn't move. It stalls, trapped between two areas of high pressure, like a stone wedge between two walls. A meteorologist today, looking at this pattern, would recognize it instantly. But in 1888, there were no satellites, no radar, no real-time forecasting. There were only observers, telegraphs, and guesswork. The next morning, New York's newspapers were still calling for light rain. A few hours later, the temperature would plunge more than 20 degrees. The wind would go from a light breeze to gusts over 75 miles per hour, and the busiest city in the United States would simply stop functioning. How did a Sunday rain shower turn, in a matter of hours, into the deadliest natural disaster ever recorded in the American Northeast? How did more than 400 people die on streets they crossed every single day? And why, nearly a century and a half later, does this storm still shape how entire cities are built, how trains run, how power reaches our homes, and how meteorologists try to predict the next disaster before it happens? This is the story of the Great Blizzard of 1888. It is not just the story of a storm. It is the story of how America discovered, in the worst possible way, that it trusted its own ability to predict nature far more than it should have. Before we continue, a simple invitation. If you're the kind of person who likes to understand not just what happened, but why it happened and why it still matters, consider subscribing to this channel. We tell stories like this every week, always with the same care for the facts and for the people who live through them. If you're watching right now, drop a comment telling us which city or country you're watching from. It's always remarkable to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to the days before the storm, when no one in New York, Boston, or Hartford had any idea what was about to begin. In March of 1888, the United States is living through a moment of technological pride. New York is the richest city on the continent. Its streets are covered by a dense web of wires, telegraph wires, telephone wires, wires from newly installed electric lines. Wooden poles hold up, each one dozens of tangled cables stacked on top of one another, often with no safety standard at all. This is considered progress. The streets of Manhattan, Boston, and Hartford pulse with the movement of horse-drawn streetcars. Thousands of animals work daily hauling carriages, delivering coal, transporting milk and mail. The train is the circulatory system of the region. It carries passengers, goods, mail, and news between cities that, without it, would be deeply isolated. Meteorology, meanwhile, is still in its infancy. The U.S. Army Signal Service, responsible for weather forecasting at the time, depends on observers scattered across different cities who send reports by telegraph a few times a day. There is no concept yet of a cold front, a warm front, or a stationary low-pressure system as we understand them today. Forecasts cover, at most, a few hours ahead, and often get even that wrong. On the night of Sunday, March 11th, the official bulletin predicted only rain, followed by colder winds. No one in New York canceled plans. No one in Boston closed the schools. No one in Hartford brought the livestock in early. Life went on completely as normal. Shopkeepers prepared their windows for the week ahead. Children got ready for school the next morning. Senators, bankers, and laborers all made the exact same plan. Wake up, get dressed, and head to work, just as they had the day before, and just as they assumed they would the day after. This is the central piece of the tragedy about to unfold. Not the strength of the wind, not the amount of snow, but the absolute, calm, unquestioned normalcy of the night before. The more ordinary a Sunday feels, the wider the gap between what people expected and what was about to happen. There was, quietly, a structural flaw in how America understood weather. Trust in forecasting was low, but paradoxically, trust in urban infrastructure was far too high. Engineers believed overhead wires were the definitive solution for electrifying and connecting cities. No one had seriously tested what would happen if tens of thousands of these wires, stacked on the same wooden poles, were subjected to violent winds and the weight of ice. Likewise, the railroad system, the pride of American industrial progress, had no protection whatsoever against extreme blizzards. Trains kept running on open tracks, with no windbreaks, no contingency plan for prolonged shutdowns. And there was a third illusion, perhaps the most dangerous of all, the belief that winter was essentially over. It was mid-March. Spring felt close. Heavier clothing was already being packed away in many homes. Coal reserves in many houses were lower than they would have been in the depths of January. No one suspected that winter still had its hardest blow left to deliver. This is the invisible error, small, quiet, buried in everyday decisions, but decisive once the storm finally arrived. Out over the Atlantic, off the coast, two atmospheric currents converge exactly where no one expected them to. Modern meteorologists, reconstructing the event decades later using pressure and temperature data, identified the exact pattern. A low-pressure system moving in from the interior of the continent meets an unusually cold polar air mass dropping down from Canada at the very moment a ridge of high pressure settles to the north, blocking any escape route for the storm. The result is rare and dangerous. The system gets trapped. Instead of crossing the coast and moving out to sea, as most winter storms do, it stalls off New Jersey and Long Island and stays there almost motionless for more than 2 days. Meanwhile, warm, moist air from the Atlantic keeps feeding the system with moisture. Polar air keeps feeding it with extreme cold. It's like lighting a bonfire and, at the same time, dumping a bucket of ice over it, without pause, only on an atmospheric scale. On Sunday night, the rain over New York begins to cool. By around 1 in the morning on Monday, March 12th, the rain turns to snow. The temperature, which hours earlier stood near 50 degrees Fahrenheit, plunges below freezing within hours. The first signs appear quietly. Telegraph wires begin to gather a thin coat of ice. The first poles start to creak under the weight. Sailors in New York's harbor notice that the wind, moderate until now, is starting to shift and gain strength in an unusual way. No one knows it yet, but the city has just crossed the last border of normalcy. Monday, before dawn, the snow doesn't fall, it's hurled sideways by the wind. Gusts pass 50 miles per hour, then 60, then more than 75 in parts of the coast. Workers who leave home before sunrise, following their usual routine, find something completely different for what they expected. The streets, only wet the night before, now vanish beneath layers of snow that grow deeper by the hour. Horse-drawn streetcars get stuck in the middle of the avenues. The horses themselves, exhausted and blinded by the snow, refuse to go any further. Drivers abandon their cars in the middle of the street. Within hours, dozens of streetcars form a frozen, buried line along Broadway. The wind brings down the first telegraph poles. As they fall, they drag down dozens of electrical and telephone wires, which tangle in the streets like black serpents across the white snow. The city that once proudly displayed its modernity through miles of overhead wires now watches that same infrastructure become a deadly hazard. Live electrical wires, still carrying current, lying tangled in the snow on the sidewalks. Meanwhile, on trains crossing inland Connecticut and Massachusetts, passengers begin to realize something is very wrong. The trains slow down, then stop completely, blocked by snowdrifts already taller than the locomotives themselves. Passengers are trapped inside the cars for hours, in some cases for more than a full day. In New York, Senator Roscoe Conkling, one of the country's most influential politicians, once considered a potential presidential candidate, decides to walk the roughly 2 miles between his office on Wall Street and his home. Like so many others, he believes a short walk poses no real risk. It takes him more than 3 hours to complete the trip. He would pay for that decision with his life. Days later, a victim of exhaustion and extreme exposure to the cold. With every passing hour, the city that once seemed unbreakable reveals another weakness. And the storm, far from weakening, only grows stronger. By Monday morning, much of New York, Boston, Hartford, New Haven, and Providence is, in practice, paralyzed. New York's elevated trains, the very symbol of the era's urban modernity, become stuck on their own tracks, suspended several stories above the streets, unable to move against the wind and the accumulated snow. Passengers are trapped inside the elevated cars for hours, exposed to extreme cold, with no safe way to climb down. At one point, residents of nearby buildings improvise ladders and ropes to help passengers descend from the stranded cars, suspended above streets buried in snow. On the ground, pedestrians who insist on moving on foot face an almost invisible enemy. Fine, dry snow, driven by the wind, cuts visibility down to just a few feet. Many completely lose their sense of direction on streets they had walked for years. Some fall into snowbanks taller than a person and cannot climb out on their own. Along the coast, the situation is even more dramatic. Dozens of vessels, from small fishing boats to large merchant ships, are caught off guard by the storm's sudden force. Many sink or run aground along the coasts of New Jersey, New York, and New England. An estimated 100-plus sailors lost their lives at sea during the storm, nearly a quarter of the disaster's total death toll. In Connecticut, towns like New Haven and Middletown record snowfall totals over 45 inches, with winds piling snow and drifts as high as 40 feet in some spots, tall enough to bury three-story houses completely. In New York, the temperature drops below 8 degrees Fahrenheit on Tuesday, March 13th, still considered one of the coldest readings ever recorded in the city this late in the season. Communications between Washington, New York, and Boston are completely cut off. Telegraph wires, brought down by the weight of ice and the force of the wind, leave entire cities isolated from one another, unable to know what is happening just a few miles away. For the first time in decades, the eastern seaboard of the United States, the financial and political nerve center of the country, simply vanishes from the map of communication. When the storm finally begins to weaken, on Wednesday, March 14th, what remains is not just snow. It's a landscape of quiet devastation. Entire streets in New York disappear beneath mountains of snow so tall that pedestrians walk at rooftop level with the ground floor houses beside them. Rescue crews, many of them made up of volunteers, neighbors, and firefighters, begin digging through the snow in search of people trapped in abandoned streetcars, stalled train cars, or simply buried in the snow while trying to walk home. In Manhattan, many of the bodies found in the following days belonged to people who worked just a few blocks from home, but who became completely disoriented in the blizzard and succumbed to the cold before they could ask for help. Hotels turned their lobbies into makeshift shelters. The famous Astor Hotel, for instance, sets up dozens of cots to house people unable to make it home. Solidarity appears too. Neighbors share firewood and food. Shopkeepers open their stores to shelter strangers. Entire families crowd into a single room to conserve heat as coal supplies begin to run dangerously low in the extreme cold. At the same time, the cleanup effort is enormous. With no heavy machinery available, crews of workers rely on shovels, picks, and, in many cases, draft animals to try to reopen streets and rail lines. It would take days, in some areas, more than a week, before trains resumed normal service and daily life in the Northeast major cities began to return to something resembling normal. The final death toll would surpass 400 people, roughly 200 of them in New York City alone. Property damage was estimated, at the time, at $20 to $25 million, equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars today. But the most important part of this story hadn't even started yet. In the months and years that followed, engineers, politicians, and scientists in New York and Boston faced an uncomfortable question. How could such an advanced city be brought to its knees so easily by a single storm? The answer pointed directly at choices made in the decades before. The tangle of overhead wires, once a symbol of progress, was now seen as an unacceptable hazard. In the years following the blizzard, New York and other major American cities began burying electrical and telephone cables underground on a massive scale, removing them from the surface for good. What seems obvious today, that power lines should be protected below ground, was born in large part as a direct response to the collapse caused by the 1888 blizzard. The chaos caused by stranded elevated trains and paralyzed surface streetcars also accelerated a debate that already existed but had lacked political urgency: the need for a transportation system shielded from the weather. Less than 2 decades later, in 1904, New York would open the first lines of its underground subway, today one of the largest transit networks in the world. Historians and engineers of the era frequently cited the total paralysis caused by the 1888 blizzard as one of the decisive arguments for investing in a transportation system protected beneath the streets, immune to conditions on the surface. In the field of meteorology, the impact was just as profound, though slower to arrive. The Signal Service's failure to predict, even a few hours in advance, the storm's intensity exposed serious flaws in the country's weather observation and communication systems. That failure, along with other criticisms of the military-run weather service, contributed to a process that, just 2 years later, in 1890, led to the creation of the United States Weather Bureau, a civilian weather agency, more scientifically grounded and independent from military command. Decades later, meteorologists would use the Great Blizzard of 1888 as one of the foundational case studies for understanding blocked low-pressure systems. Storms that, trapped between areas of high pressure, remained stationary for days, intensifying rather than moving on and dissipating. That scientific understanding, refined throughout the 20th century, became essential to more accurately forecasting the nor'easters that still regularly strike the East Coast today. What actually changed after the Great Blizzard of 1888? Cities changed the way they build electrical infrastructure, favoring underground cables over networks exposed to the weather. Major cities changed the way they think about public transit, accelerating the construction of subway systems shielded from outside conditions. The institutional structure of American meteorology changed, contributing to the creation of a more robust civilian weather service, whose direct descendants still exist today. The scientific understanding of stationary storms changed, knowledge that, more than a century later, meteorologists still use to forecast modern nor'easters with far more advanced warning than was possible in 1888. And, perhaps more subtly, the relationship between American society and its own vulnerability to nature changed as well. A generation that saw in technology and engineering an almost total shield against the whims of weather was forced to recognize that no city, however advanced, is immune to phenomena it doesn't yet fully understand. What didn't change, though, is just as important. Stationary storms like the one in 1888 still happen. Modern nor'easters, though now forecast days in advance thanks to satellites and computer models, can still shut down entire cities, knock out power grids, and put lives at risk when urban infrastructure isn't ready for them. Humanity's dependence on complex, interconnected systems, electrical, transportation, communication, remains, just as it was in 1888, both a source of comfort and a point of fragility whenever nature decides to test its limits. The storm that began as an ordinary Sunday rain ended up quietly redrawing how entire cities would be built in the decades that followed. The wires that once crossed the New York sky now run, unseen, beneath our feet. The trains that once stopped on tracks exposed to the wind now glide, protected deep underground. And the forecast that once reached only a few hours ahead can now, thanks in part to the lessons learned from this disaster, warn entire populations days in advance. But nature keeps holding surprises that science still isn't fully able to anticipate. Blocked atmospheric systems, like the one that paralyzed the American Northeast in 1888, keep forming year after year somewhere on the planet. The question that remains, more than a century later, isn't whether a storm of this magnitude will happen again. It's whether, when it does, we'll actually be more prepared, or whether we've simply traded one illusion of safety for another.